Chapter 2, Effects of COVID-19. Dynamics, Round of Reflection. Objectives, Personal reflection on your COVID-19 experience. Introduction to the subject. This is an icebreaker round. It is a general question that helps the facilitator to get a feel for the participants. All the participants answer. It is a way to listen to people's impressions and experiences and to know where each person stands. Questions. What has your life experience with the COVID-19 phenomenon been like? How the COVID-19 pandemic has affected our mental health. The coronavirus has brought about many changes in our societies. One of the consequences has been an increase in psychological stress. Fears about the health impacts of the virus, worries about family members, widespread social isolation, economic problems, and uncertainty have caused distress to people all over the world. Medicine and technology provide very concrete and precise tools that allow people to believe that everything is under control. Mental health is another matter. Everything psychological, despite having a scientific basis for the most part, is a field that is generally scary because of the lack of knowledge, because of how much there is to learn, and because the mind is much more abstract and therefore less tangible. Review: the mental health consequences for some people have increased the prevalence of certain disorders and aggravated others. A significant increase in rates of anxiety and depression. In fact, the World Health Organization, WHO, warned in mid-May 2020 that the coronavirus crisis and its consequences would affect the mental health of many people. The organization explained that there could be an increase in suicides and disorders, and called on governments not to neglect psychological care. According to the WHO, an increase in distress of 35% was detected in China, 60% in Iran, and 40% in the United States, three of the countries most affected by the pandemic. Looking at the most affected groups, we can classify them according to different factors. People with certain conditions of vulnerability and risk factors are seeing their health more seriously affected, both organically and psychologically. Age and sex: children, adolescents, women, and the elderly. Ethnicity: migrant population, minority groups, undocumented persons, history of physical and/or mental illness, disabled persons, long-standing psychiatric patients and past mental disorders, chronic illnesses. Economic and social conditions: population in situation of poverty, precarious employment, unfavorable living conditions, social marginalization, illegal residence, lack of social support networks, unsanitary and/or uninhabitable housing, homelessness, history of violence and traumatic events, women threatened by previous gender-based violence, family violence situations, history of child abuse, victims of other forms of violence, populations frequently affected by natural disasters. Institutionalization: members of health, social, institutional and community teams, old people's homes, residential centers for children and adolescents, psychiatric centers, prisons, sheltered flats, shelters and internment centers for immigrants and homeless. Other, self-perceived poor state of health: difficulties with information, frustration, boredom, loneliness, insufficient supplies, economic and occupational losses, feelings of deprivation of liberty, non-existence or non-utilization of the protective factor of the feeling of solidarity and mutual support. The COVID-19 pandemic has only amplified a latent issue: mental health. For this reason, it becomes an opportunity to give this issue the importance it deserves. Consequences of COVID that affect our mental health: uncertainty about the future, isolation, fear, grief, etc. Stress. The physical consequences of the coronavirus are widely known to the public and have been repeatedly discussed and reported in the media. So much has been reported on the protocols, prevention, diagnosis, consequences, and care of COVID-19 that the mental health effects, as is often the case in general, are overshadowed and the impact underestimated. Initially, the focus was on China and the appearance of the virus, as well as the drastic measures implemented there, such as confinement. In Europe, it was initially seen as something distant, and mentally we protected ourselves by believing we were invincible and untouchable, like in a science fiction film. However, as the first cases emerged in Europe, this sense of invincibility turned into vulnerability and uncertainty. For those who need to control and project into the future, the situation becomes uncontrollable, leading to feelings of anxiety and stress. Meanwhile, some people still felt invincible, leading to a skeptical social sector and the emergence of dissent. As a result, society became divided, and relationships deteriorated or drifted apart, leading to feelings of anger and frustration. Confinement measures were implemented, which intensified feelings of uncertainty and fear behind previously secure and calm feelings. During confinement, people experienced isolation, distress, and stress. Meanwhile, deaths continued to rise, leading to statistical numbers, borderline situations in hospitals, chaos, and heightened levels of fear. Then, as the pandemic progressed, different consequences emerged. First, there was talk of China and the appearance of the virus, as well as the drastic measures that were implemented, such as confinement. In Europe, it was initially perceived as something distant, and on a mental level, we protected ourselves by believing we were invincible, untouchable. Like in a science fiction film. However, as the first cases emerged in Europe, the once invincible feelings turned into vulnerability and uncertainty. For brains that need to control and project into the future, the situation becomes uncontrollable, and the body responds with anguish and stress. For another part of the population, they still felt untouchable. A skeptical social sector emerged, and dissidence set in. Society became divided, with the consequent deterioration of relationships that broke down or drifted apart. Feelings of anger and frustration appeared. Then confinement began, and behind the previously secure and calm feelings, much more intense feelings of uncertainty and fear arose. During confinement, people experienced feelings of isolation, distress, and stress. As the de-escalation began, some people experienced fear of going out and fear of contagion, while others felt liberation and relief. In the transition to the present day, the focus of the alarm in public places and health centers has been maintained, but daily life has been normalized. During the confinement, many of us spent many hours locked up at home and unable to see our family and friends. Although the strict quarantine has gradually been lifted, some people have refused to go outside out of fear. This fear is known as cabin syndrome. It is important to specify that it is not a pathology as such. This syndrome involves a fear of contact with other people outside the home, a fear of carrying out activities that were once everyday activities such as working outside the home, traveling on public transport, and interacting with other people we know. People who have experienced solitary confinement are more likely to develop cabin syndrome. The absence of physical or close contact with others may have created a form of aversion to what is now exceptional for them: contact with other people. Effects on different political, economic, family systems, etc. And focus on education. The pandemic, as a biopsychosocial phenomenon, affects all social classes and all continents, but has not been socially egalitarian. The impoverished groups, socially and emotionally, the institutionalized elderly and the precariat of our societies are paying the brunt of the consequences, both emotionally and socio-economically, as well as in terms of morbidity and mortality. The economic predictions of the European Union are likely to lead to an increase in social dysfunctions, inequality and poverty, and to a powerful eruption of changes at the personal, emotions, thoughts, values, group, interpersonal relations, social organization, and also global relations between blocks and continents levels. A pandemic also presents itself as a new area for market interests, such as in this case, the pharmaceutical industry with the production of vaccines, sales of medicines and masks. At a societal level, a division has been created. The strategy of divide and rule has been used for centuries to control large numbers of people within societies or even other nations, through empires. This strategy is still used today in various ways and for different purposes, even at the individual level, for example when assigning certain privileges within a work team. In reality, the strategy of division affects our cultures and minds unconsciously by making our shared interests invisible, and preventing us from cooperating towards common goals. It damages our personal relationships to such an extent that we end up considering these differences as inherent to human nature, dividing society and making it more manageable. Mental health. Home confinement and physical and social distancing disrupt relational processes. Processes that are the foundation of mental health, availability of social support, daily interaction, and coping skills. Disruption of these processes is associated with higher levels of psychological distress and even disorders, due to excessive anxiety, depression, insomnia, and post-traumatic stress syndrome, despite the protective effects of available social resources. Another factor to take into account is the accumulated mourning processes due to the various losses suffered in the pandemic, the ensuing economic crisis, and the fear of the future. Education and vulnerable. School closures and restrictions on social activities increase the risks to children's and adolescents' mental health, emotionally, relationally, and learning. Adolescents and adults and children with severe psychiatric disorders have experienced changes and disruptions in their care during home confinement, followed in the medium term by worsening symptoms. The physical and mental health of older people is also being negatively affected, with an increase in sleep problems, sedentary lifestyles, anxiety disorders, and depression. The cognitive repercussions of social and affective isolation remain to be seen, but it is known that decreased social interaction has a negative impact on the mental and physical health of older people. It should be noted that the impact of the pandemic has not been the same for men as for women, neither at the clinical, epidemiological, nor socio-economic level. Women have been more exposed to the risk of infection because of their greater presence in frontline professions and care settings and essential services, health, social services, formal and informal care, food, commerce, and cleaning. They also play a central role in domestic tasks and care and suffer to a greater extent from situations of precariousness and poverty. Violence against women and children and other types of domestic violence have increased during the pandemic. After the pandemic, in population groups with high infection and mortality rates, in families with lower household incomes, and in the precariat, a high incidence of emotional disturbances is likely to appear, which are already visible in the relational disturbances of some social groups. In these situations of social and political crisis, it is easy to attribute all emotional suffering to mental disorders, or, worse, to mental illness, contributing to the medicalization and psychiatrization of the population. This approach risks fostering a mental health epidemic, with emotional and social manifestations related to serious socio-economic situations being diagnosed as depression or anxiety crises, which would subside if they were resolved. The only result of this supposed epidemic of mental disorders would be an increase in the consumption of psychotropic drugs, which would also take resources away from community care activities, and this in a country like ours, which is already one of the biggest consumers of psychotropic drugs in the world. It is not mental health measures, and even less psychiatric pharmacological measures, that are the priority for the emotional well-being of the population during a crisis, but social and psychosocial measures. Proposals for action must begin with the recognition that we are facing a new global health, economic, and ecological crisis. Consequently, it will be necessary to implement measures aimed at the health system and its professionals, political institutions, and the population. But we must not forget that the decisive measures are the socio-economic and political reforms needed to cushion the consequences of the deterioration of the country's economic activity, unemployment, and growing job insecurity. Reducing inequalities and poverty is the fundamental way to take care of the health and mental health of the population. How school closures have affected students and teachers. To understand how school closures have affected students and teachers, we must first understand how the learning process works. In this case, we will consider the basic principles of neuroeducation. We need to look not only at the brain, we need to take a broader and more holistic view of the learning process, because the brain works holistically, i.e., body and mind are interdependent. Gene-environment interaction. Experience transforms the brain. Physical exercise has been shown to increase vascularization, leading to increased oxygen and glucose in the brain, release of neurotransmitters and brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. This promotes neurogenesis, memory, attention and motivation, and the development of complex neural circuits related to movement, and their interconnection with the executive functions of the brain, Doherty and Fors-Miravalis, 2020. Even movement for a few minutes in the classroom can improve selective attention. In addition, since movement activities usually involve interaction and eye contact, the social brain is stimulated, activating mirror neurons that promote empathy, releasing endorphins, and providing a sense of well-being. The Swedish study of more than 1 million children between the ages of 15 and 18 showed that physical skills were predictive of intellectual ability. In addition, aerobic endurance during adolescence was found to be directly related to socio-economic status and academic achievement in adulthood. Memory systems are interactive. Cognitive emotional processes in partnership. Another example is stress. Stress is the body's response to bring it back into balance in the face of a threat. Eustress, or positive, short-term stress, is the response to a threat that the body and mind can cope with. Distress is long-term stress, when the brain cannot find a solution, and threats, whether real or fictitious, overload the amygdala with warning stimuli. The body responds by secreting cortisol, a hormone that at low levels is basic for our survival, but at high levels becomes toxic for our organism. Rojas, 2019. At the educational level, eustress is beneficial because it prevents boredom and complacency, but distress can lead to anxiety or burnout. In addition, high and toxic cortisol levels negatively affect memory because the hippocampus has many receptors for this hormone. Neurogenesis, language skills, social skills, etc. are also affected. Guillen, 2015. The amygdala goes into hyperexcitability mode, sending continuous warning signals to the brain. The amygdala goes into survival mode, affecting learning. Attachment bonding is the basis for change. Imagination activates and stimulates brain systems. Verbal and non-verbal information. Care of basic functions, such as sleep. Students. Lack of routine. Unequal opportunities. Class at home in front of a screen. No social interaction. Loss of the safe space and support network that schools provide in many cases. Overburdened parents, guardians. Teachers. Coping with technological media. Tackling the task of distance teaching. Lack of resources. Reconciling family and professional life. Inequality caused by COVID in school communities. To understand how COVID-19 has caused inequalities in school communities, we first need to understand how society is divided due to the oppression of the system. Structural. Siblings or not. Country-town. Flat or house infrastructure. Teachers more or less involved. More or less consolidated school communities. Dependence of the family. Resources, social class. Technological means. Parents or guardians who are teachers or who can accompany their children in schoolwork. School and teachers equipped with digital resources and tools. Healthy economies that can sustain a period of time without income and do not have an impact on the parents' stress that is projected onto their children. Dynamics, the carousel of oppressions. Objective, to explain how society organizes oppressions and their structures. The aim is not to convince participants that society is structured in a certain way or that things happen in a certain way, but to facilitate thinking, reflection, and discussion, as we have briefly touched on many intense topics. The next exercise is to draw a picture of the carousel of oppressions, for example, on a blackboard or a large piece of paper. This simple illustration serves as a framework for understanding how oppressions are structured in society and helps facilitate the exercise. The exercise consists of 3 phases. First phase, the central pillar of the carousel. First, we will draw the central pillar of the carousel, symbolizing the class division created by classism. We will divide the pillar into 4 sections, 1 for each social class. Economic exploitation has been and continues to be the fundamental cause of all other oppressions, so it holds a central role in relation to all other oppressions. We will start by writing social excluded in the bottom section of the pillar, representing those who have the least resources and production capacity in society. We will ask the participants if anyone identifies with this category. If so, we will have the opportunity to observe that those who belong to this group are typically very poor, elderly, sick, homeless, disabled, migrants, refugees, or ethnic minorities. In the next section, we can write about the next social category, which is the working class. This group is focused on the production of goods and services in our society. Participants who identify themselves or their families as belonging to this group can share their thoughts or experiences. Moving up, we reach the next section where the middle class belongs. It would be interesting to engage in a brief discussion here about the perceived differences between the working class and the middle class. In reality, both groups are essentially the same. Although both classes work daily, the middle class tends to have slightly higher income and more access to information, enabling them to organize and coordinate the working class, which constitutes the majority. Therefore, both groups are composed of workers, even though one possesses more power. Finally, in the drawing, we reach the uppermost section of the central pillar of the carousel, where we find the owning or wealthy class. This group accumulates the majority of the real wealth in society and owns large companies, so they typically do not need to work on a daily basis for survival. They represent a very small percentage of the population. Second phase, the carousel horses. Around the central pillar of the carousel of classism, we will draw several horses, one for each oppression: sexism, racism, adultism, and the oppression of people with different abilities. We will label each horse with the name of the corresponding oppression and take a moment to explain how each oppression operates, highlighting the conditioning messages that they instill in individuals based on their identities, among other factors. The role of each oppression is to reinforce social differences and ensure the smooth functioning of the oppressive system. This means that all oppressions aim to divide people based on their identities, creating separation and enabling constant economic profit. We will omit drawing the horse representing the oppression of mental health, as it holds a distinct role in society. Third phase, the ceiling of the carousel. In this final phase, we will draw the roof of the carousel, which serves to connect all the horses' oppressions. Placed on top of the carousel, it symbolizes the oppression of mental health. This particular oppression perpetuates and sustains the entire social system. It compels us to conform to societal norms, behave accordingly, and follow the established rules, thereby suppressing our emotions. Any resistance or challenge to this normality leads to further oppression. This phase provides an opportunity to explain and reflect on the concept of mental health oppression and how it manifests in our lives. For example, we can discuss how society inundated us with diverse and numerous oppressive messages from birth, dictating what is right and wrong, good and bad, normal and abnormal, and acceptable or unacceptable ways and times to express our emotions. When we experience harm during childhood due to oppressive societal messages, we instinctively resist their effects. We struggle to believe that things are as society presents them, and find it challenging to comprehend the reasons behind injustices and abuses. Consequently, when we encounter such distressing situations, our innate sense of equality and justice prompts us to react emotionally, employing coping mechanisms to heal from the confusion and distress. However, society typically discourages and suppresses these emotional expressions, except in extreme circumstances. Instead, society systematically oppresses these natural healing processes by inundating us with oppressive messages, forcing us to suppress our emotions. Unfortunately, from our earliest days, we have all been subjected to this harmful oppression. Families, as the initial oppressive institution, teach and train us to inhibit the open expression of our emotions. Over time, other institutions such as education and sports reinforce the oppression of mental health. As for the structures that support the oppression of mental health, we can explain to participants that society has even gone so far as to design specialized strategies and treatments to numb, or even places to hide those individuals, especially adults, who still experience deep emotions and struggle to control their emotional outbursts in a manner considered proper. These strategies include medication, drugs, therapies, psychiatric institutions, and so on. When resources are scarce, people who do not conform to societal norms and express their emotions more openly than expected, even if the sources of harm and their actions differ greatly, often resort to psychiatric medication, because they genuinely do not know how to manage their feelings and emotions as society expects. People who are unable to keep their emotions hidden or control their behavior normally are not understood or accepted by society. In fact, certain institutions and companies take advantage of this situation and sell products or services to these individuals that help them avoid expressing their emotions. In other words, they sell products that numb them, such as alcohol, tobacco, sweets, and so on. Society permits these legal intoxicants as they do not significantly impair our ability to work, yet they numb us and prevent us from bringing about the necessary changes to the oppressive society that harms us. Religion is another institution that enables and promotes the oppression of mental health. Its teachings often revolve around concepts of good and evil, sin and punishment. These concepts reinforce the notion that individuals are individually responsible and guilty when things go wrong, thus deserving punishment. Consequently, religious messages encourage people to behave in ways deemed right, by being good and numbing their emotions. At this point, the facilitator can explain what society does to individuals who do not fit into the system or exhibit disruptive behaviors, they are isolated and punished through imprisonment. Others who avoid such behaviors, psychotropic drugs, or numbness may feel entirely lost, alone, and misunderstood, eventually succumbing to suicidal thoughts, believing that life is unbearable and devoid of meaning. Throughout the activity, it is important to periodically remind participants that when we refer to society, we are referring to all people, including the participants themselves, as society consists of all human beings living within it. We have all experienced various social oppressions, at least during our childhood, but we also contribute to the transmission of oppressive values to others. Therefore, it is crucial for us to be aware of our active role within the social machinery. Facilitators should be prepared for defensive reactions from some participants, as there is often resistance and individuals may attempt to justify their behaviors and oppressive roles, as they have not yet recognized the internalized oppressive beliefs within them. Therefore, the facilitator should emphasize that no one is born as an oppressor or with the belief in conditioning messages. It is not an innate human condition. No one chooses to oppress or internalize oppressive messages, but all individuals inherit these social impositions. While these social impositions make us vulnerable to behaving in oppressive ways, we must take responsibility for the harm we cause.